Are many of your potential clients hitting you with, let me think about it, and so you struggle to close the deal? Perhaps you've crunched the numbers, you've delivered the perfect pitch, and yet your prospects still won't commit. No matter how much logic and data you present, they hesitate, drag their feet, and your sales are stalling. It's frustrating, exhausting, and it's killing your momentum. The facts just aren't moving the needle. So how do you stop the indecision and start closing deals faster? To help with this question, I'm excited to have Kelvin Geick, the co-founder of 2080 and Helm, on the podcast. Kelvin is a master at using emotional intelligence to turn indecision into action. He's helped his companies scale rapidly, turning hesitant prospects into quick yeses by tapping into what really drives decisions: emotions, not the numbers. His approach has transformed his sales teams, and the results are undeniable. So in this episode, we'll dive deep into how Kelvin has shifted his approach, how he's trained his team to prioritize emotions, and the impressive growth they've achieved as a result. Welcome to De-Stress Your Business, the podcast where we show you how to get incredible results in your business without constant stress. I'm Alexis Kingsbury, a serial entrepreneur and founder at AirManual, and I'm joined by the amazing Kelvin Geick. Welcome to the podcast, Kelvin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This will be great.
Cool. Well, your journey from finance to co-founding 2080 and Helm and so on is impressive. Talk us through that journey, but also particularly the sort of driving force that led to you focusing on the emotional intelligence in business.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And to be honest, it's actually really well timed because I've been doing a lot of speaking events recently around vision and how that equates to the emotional side of the business and how that can actually help you, specifically for accountants and bookkeepers and people in the finance industry. So if I rewind it, where I started was when I was a kid. I grew up on a farm, and I was always trained, I guess is the best way to put it, and taught to help people out, right? And so if my dad needed help picking rocks, rototilling, cutting trees, whatever that might be, we were always out doing something together. And when we always looked at how we helped our neighbors, meaning, they were like 10 miles away, that was our closest neighbor, we would literally go out and we'd help build a garage or help fix a piece of equipment, or there was never any questions asked. And the reason that I'm starting with that is because it leads into the overarching storyline or origin story here. So, that was my life. That's what I knew. We always grew up with people, support, community, all of those kind of values, which I thought was really cool. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was pretty cool. Then you fast forward to, say, high school, where we started having job fairs around. What do you want to do with your life? What's going to happen after in university? What are you going to do for a job, etc.? And I really had no clue. And my mom turned to me during one of these job fairs at our high school and said, well, you really like numbers. You read all these books, because I literally was reading finance books as a kid, but I never put two and two together. That's just what I read. She's like, why don't you look at accounting or business management or something like that? And I said, that actually sounds really interesting. So got into accounting in university, started looking at that, started looking at becoming a CA, chartered accountant here in Canada, which is now a CPA. I took all of the accounting classes that I needed to become a CPA until I got to the auditing class. And I did well in it, but I absolutely hated it. I hated it. So I literally turned to myself internally and said, I don't actually think I want to be an accountant anymore. So I took a look at all of my grades and what I like to do. And there's finance, and it's a very subtle gradient between accounting and finance. But I really, truly love finance. I love the forward-looking aspect of it. I like the budgets and the forecasts and, helping people plan. And so I started looking at the Chartered Financial Analyst program. Now, to do that, I needed a job because I had to pay my own way. So started working here in oil and gas. I live in Calgary, Canada, so that's major industry here. Started out as a mail boy, started working my way up the ladder, corporate ladder, senior accountant, controller, CFO, started getting into those roles. Worked with a team that essentially bought and sold small companies to larger companies. And so they just kept rotating. And as they did that, they had all these private side investments that they would do. So rural garbage company. So here in Canada, everybody lives in the country essentially, and the country is very vast. how do you actually do garbage delivery for somebody that's 20 miles outside of a city center? It's a very unique business model. So we got to help people figure that out. Online book publishing, and keep in mind, given my bald head and gray hair here, this is many decades ago. I was one of those people that was born before Google. So an online book publishing company was a very novel idea, right? And this person had this vision, but no clue on how to execute it. When I was working with this management team for this oil and gas company, that's the kind of stuff that I got to do for my side work. That was, can you go help this person out? Which that fed into what I was talking about earlier, like that fed into, help these people out, support them, create that sense of community, and together we'll do better. So ultimately speaking, this oil and gas company, the managers retired. They were quite old. Oil and gas downturn happened, and they said, look, we've made enough. We've done enough. We want to be done. We're out. And so I really had to look at myself and say, what do I want to do? And I looked at all of those side businesses and how we were able to help them. And I said, that would be really cool to do. Let's do that. So we started 2080, which is a fractional finance company, specifically with a focus around CFO controllership work. So advisory work, helping people create strategies, business plans, putting financial models to them, and then ultimately helping them execute that vision. And that's truly where that story arc where I started with really starts to feed in, because that's, in my opinion, there's lots of people doing what I just described. But the key difference on how we're doing it and why we're doing it is from that position of helping real people to have real emotions. Like these are their babies. If something happens to it, it affects them in multiple different ways, not just financially. And understanding that, we really try to meet people emotionally, understand the field that they're playing on, and then helping them on that field, truly becoming a team member and progressing them from that. And so it's very interesting to me, that story arc and how it's happened. We've been really successful with what we've done. The last 3 to 4 years, we kind of reinvented ourselves with this emotional EQ type slant. And, it's 50 to 100% growth every year, which has been a journey in of itself and quite fun. It's got its up and downs too, but it's been really fun, especially with all the people that we've been able to help.
That's amazing. I love that. And yeah, thank you for taking us through that kind of arc and that story of sort of essentially what's fed into your values and why you've built your career in the way that you did, particularly that point around the emotional intelligence and so on. What was there a particular moment perhaps where you realized how that could be used, particularly as part of the sales strategy? I mean, you've alluded there to the incredible sort of growth rates that you've had. Give us a moment of when you realize, actually, this is a specific thing I'm doing and getting this direct result.
Yeah, to be honest, there actually isn't a specific event.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of a specific time frame where 3 to 4 years ago, I don't know if I was having a midlife crisis or what it is, but we were always really good at helping other people on the playing field, like I say. But it's almost like cobbler's kids have no shoes. When I looked at my own business, we were flatlining for the better part of 6-7 years, which is fine. Like there was nothing wrong with it. We were doing really well. We enjoyed what we did. But I sat back and I remember being at one of my son's birthday parties with one of his friends. And I was talking to one of the fathers there. We're, not super close, but we're acquaintances. We know each other. He's in investment management and finance. And I remember him saying an adage that I've heard many, many times before that really never affected me. But I, keep in context, it's like something doesn't really feel right. We're doing this steady state thing and that's okay, but it doesn't feel awesome. And then he said, well, if you're not growing, you're dying. And I don't know why, but when he said that, I just, we're in his backyard, kids are jumping in the hot tub, making a huge mess. And it's almost like the world just kind of stopped. I was like, I've heard this 1,000 times before. But why is this one time it triggered? It was really odd to me. So I took a step back and I looked at how we were doing things. And it's like, okay, well, the steady state's fine. We're happy with it. But what's really driving me right now is we're not actually feeding into that ethos of support, emotion, and all of this other stuff. Like we're helping people out on their finances doing that. But we could be so much more if we actually applied that to the sales side of things. Because people, it was like this epiphany in my head where it's like, we're doing all this stuff on the financial side, but you're growing, not dying. It means that you need this continual progression of something, whether it's sales or personal development, or it really just put my mind into this loop of if we can tap into this emotional state and do all the stuff that we're talking about with clients for ourselves, meaning like infrastructure, scale, systems and processes, like the world is our oyster here. And it was just this culmination of a bunch of stuff off that one comment where it's like, this is truly amazing. Because we had always known psychology plays an important part in terms of the finances. It's, as I said, it's very emotional. But I'd never thought about how could I use this from a sales standpoint. And so then when I started thinking, okay, well, I want to help more people. I'm not okay with the status quo, and I want to help them in cool and different ways. I actually need more clients to do that. Well, I have clients, but how do I get more, and how do I close more, and how do I impact more? It started opening up this whole other path of going down, and which I did. And we started applying some of these psychological practices. So to be honest, I've read a ton of books. I do not profess to be a psychologist at all. I've talked to a ton of people, but it boiled down to how can I apply people buy with their hearts, not their heads. The head is what comes after. It's the logic. It's not the subconscious. Yes, you need to have a deliverable. You have to have quality. You have to have value. You have to have price. You have to have that all figured out in a package. But ultimately speaking, people are buying trust and they're buying a relationship. So then that really changed the game in terms of how do we apply that in our sales strategy? How do I relate to people quicker? How can I surface their pain points? I still remember one of our team members coming on board, and I introduced her to our sales process. And she was shocked that an accountant, and I use that term loosely because, again, I'm not a registered accountant, but I do accounting and finance. She was shocked that an accountant would actually be talking about, how does your accounting feel? Like, it's one of my primary questions that I ask people. And it's an open-ended question to understand around what emotions do they have attached with their current systems and processes? How do they feel about that? Then it starts opening up other questions like, okay, how do you feel about your business? How do you feel? It's all about feeling. She was shocked at the number of times that I used the word feel. And the reason for that is I'm trying to pinpoint literal trigger points for the people around what's important to them, and not how can we hook them? Like, yes, it's a hook, but how can we help them? Because, that's what we're trying to figure out. And it's, as soon as I put my mind to that, our success rates just honestly went through the roof in terms of having conversations with people and closing them. The real problem then became to production and, bottlenecks around onboarding.
That's a problem to have. Yeah. That's amazing. I love that, because I think, as you know, I do a lot of work with the accounting, bookkeeping sort of industry. And when I've interviewed practice leaders around how they operate in their sales process, some of the leading practice owners and leaders, they will have questions that are very future focused, goals focused, good mix of personal as well as the business. So thinking about, what are your business goals, but also what are your personal goals and how are they aligned and so on. And so I've seen a lot of examples where the best ones are already doing that. But it's interesting, the nuance versus what you're describing there is, it's rather than saying, just what are the goals and what are you trying to overcome? What are your obstacles? What are the bottlenecks? Actually getting to the emotional feeling around the status quo. And particularly around, as you say, how does your accounting feel? And seeing whether it feels confused and stressed and anxious and messy and whatever, or do they feel boring and disconnected, irrelevant? And because those change how you'd then approach that conversation and talk about what you're trying to help them to do. And so I think that's really, really interesting. Are you, perhaps after making some of those changes, you mentioned training a salesperson, but what about in the conversation with the client? What do we see from the client when we ask those sorts of questions about how it's feeling and so on? What's that journey look like as part of that sales conversation?
That's a really great question, right? They feel refreshed because in our industry specifically, people don't talk to them that way. And, our methodology doesn't work with all people. Sometimes you're going to hit somebody that's not open to the emotional aspect of it. They're very closed off. They're very structured. They're very logical. And so sometimes that doesn't work. But I mean, that usually means somebody has something else going on, meaning they've got other psychological I won't say issues, but they've got psychological things that they need to contend with at that point in time. So they're just not open to the discussion at all. Because again, at the end of the day, everybody is emotional. And, as you were saying kind of what we do and how we do it, I always like to come from a position of transformational versus transactional, meaning I don't want to meet somebody in the sales process or the discovery process in terms of, I figured out your pain point, here's my deliverable. To me, that's just table stakes. Anybody can do that. And I don't want to compete with everybody. I want to up our game to the point where, blue ocean strategy. I want to create my own ocean. I want to be my own thing. I want people to perceive that, because if I can do that, price doesn't matter. I mean, it does, but it's less relevant than what it would be otherwise, because now people are relating to us in a completely different way, transformational. And it just opens up the playing field of what we can do and how we can do it. So to go back to your point, because so few people talk through the sales process and discovery process, and to be frank here, ours is very short. I only have about 1 or 2 of these meetings, whereas I know other people have like multiple, meaning like upwards of 10. I only really need 1 or 2 to surface the emotions and the pain points. And the key piece to all of that is, or the key response that they have coming out of that is just refreshed. We've literally had people on phone calls say, I've never actually had an accountant talk to me this way before. So not only have I had it from internally, but also externally, where it's like, it feels so good. We work with, say, a nonprofit. And so potentially that's a little bit misleading, because nonprofits tend to be a little bit more what I would call fuzzy. They're not typically seen as business people, strategic. But the reality is this person actually is one of the most strategic people I've ever met. So they do a lot of social enterprise. So this person speaks almost identical to an MBA, a VP exec, C-suite type level person. She's got budgets, strategies, approaches, like the whole 9 yards. And probably it was more refreshing to her because of that, because no one had ever actually talked to her about, you're doing all this hard work. You're super stressed out because it's all on you, because you're a nonprofit and you have a lack of resources. And not once did somebody say, how do you feel? And so you could just see on her face during the phone call how relieved she looked, in terms of, I now have a platform to speak to all of my grievances to, and it all dumped out. And the funny part is that, being on the other side of that gives you a wealth of information again, in terms of how you can help that person. Because you now know on an emotional level what some trigger points are, what some trigger issues are, what some areas are that are true high factor pain points for that person, that if you can solve, you've now helped them not only financially, but emotionally. And that's what I mean transformational. You've taken it to a completely different plane. It's not just a deliverable. Here's your tax return. Here's your forecast. It's like, no, we literally are coming in here, and everybody speaks to it. I hate the nuances that people use, or the phrases is the better way to put it. We will help you sleep better at night. It's like, well, what are you truly doing to actually help someone sleep better at night? Because if you're not asking the questions that I've just kind of outlined at a very high level, you're not. But that's the difference, is we are. Like, we're truly asking questions that if we help this person actually solve them, and we won't do it right away, we're very clear on that too, but we'll help them over a course of time. If we do that, they'll be way less stressed. They actually will sleep better at night, and they'll feel so much better about what they're doing, because they can focus on what's important to them and strip away what's not what we're good at. And that's what I mean by transformational. It completely changes the structure of the conversation and the service, to be frank.
Yeah, and I can see how that translates then into that clarity that you then have as a service provider on what transformation you're having, what's going to give them the biggest bang for buck. Because, for example, for some clients, you might find that actually having their bank reconciliations, etc., up to date and daily means that for them at an emotional level, it feels like there's control, there's clarity, there's visibility, and so on. Whereas for other clients, that won't move the needle at all, because their whole issue is that actually just understanding what the numbers at the top level are, and they perhaps have feelings of sort of feeling stressed around, I'm embarrassed that I don't know enough about what these actually mean. And therefore having up-to-date financials for them won't create an emotional response. Might be an important thing that their business needs, but it won't create the emotional response. Whereas creating a forum, an environment in which they can be honest about the stuff that they don't know, or indeed that there's not an assumption that they know what things mean, will have an emotional impact for that person. So I can totally see how different clients can have different emotions around what they need, and how they feel about these different things, but also how that plays out for your services. You mentioned a few of the sorts of questions that you would ask, like, how do you feel about your accounting? Or how does your accounting make you feel? How does the business make you feel? Are there any other questions that you found it particularly useful to kind of dig into those emotions and really elicit those kind of responses?
No, to be quite frank, those are really the key ones. Is I really try to leave them open-ended, because by leaving them open-ended with that emotional appeal, it provides that safe space, for lack of a better term. It allows them to open up, which then leads to other questions. So, I mean, I think you actually touched on it in a really good point where, if you're dealing with a sole proprietor, it's like the person is doing it all: service, delivery, vision, accounting, like bookkeeping. They're it. That person has a very different need set than somebody that's got a team. Whether it's 5-person, 50-person, 500, doesn't matter. It's very different. And so I've actually seen people with an emotional response around the bank recs, oddly enough. Like, that's actually not a flippant example. That's actually a real world example where those sole proprietors operate off what's off their bank account. And so it does cause them emotional stress that, well, but what's in my bank doesn't actually match what's in my Xero or my QuickBooks or my Sage. Like, it's actually literally, we've had people say, this is freaking me out. I don't know why this doesn't match. Please help me here. But if you don't ask that initial question, it's just, they won't give the emotional slant to it. They'll just say, well, they don't match and I don't understand why. They won't say the actual feeling piece with it. So with that, you can then start picking, like using that as an example. It's like, okay, so you just said that, this scares you. Why is that? So I've always learned from coaching and other, again, books and other people, don't be so quick to provide advice, ask more questions. And one of those key ones is, and what else? Meaning what I just said. You've got this bank rec, it stresses you out. Okay, well, let's dig into that. Why does that stress you out? Like, just follow that path, because as you unpack that, you're going to be pulling on those strings a bit in terms of saying, what are the exact emotions behind here? And what are those emotions tied to? Well, I am pulling this string. I'm more emotional around this bank rec because I'm really scared that this actually doesn't match and I don't have enough money. Okay, so then why does that actually concern you? Pulling that string.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, because if I don't have enough money, I might fail and I might lose my business. And that scares me because I've got a kid and a wife and I just started this and it's a huge risk and it blah, 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 blah. And so you now have a completely different lens than, I don't know why they don't match. And so you can see the perfect example of transactional. My bank rec doesn't match. I need it fixed. Versus transformational. My bank rec doesn't match and it's scaring the living beep out of me because I might actually lose my business and I'm scared my wife and my partner and my kids are going to hate me for it.
Yeah.
Like, what is more powerful, right?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. When you say it's essentially that example where it's like, yeah, I think you could probably benefit from our bookkeeping service. It's like,
right?
Yeah.
And so that's why I say, I almost feel bad about it in a way that it seems unfair. But it's not, because we're using it not from an angle of malice and greed. We're coming from a position of support, community, and help. So what we've done is we pulled that string to the point we know the true foundational reason that this person is concerned about their bank rec. We've got the emotional arc, the emotional attachment to that. And we can now, if you keep asking and what else with some of those open-ended questions on what comes out, you're going to have about 4 or 5 things that you can prioritize and say, this is the most important, then this one, then this one, then this one. That gives you a very clear picture of how you should be coming to the table. As I say, playing on the field at the same plane as this person, being a true teammate and helping support them in each one of these areas. So it's off their plate and they can just focus on scoring the goals or passing to other teammates or whatever else it is that they need to do in their journey.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I'm glad you mentioned that it can almost feel unfair, because I want to dig into that from a particular angle, because I think that it's relatively easy for us to say, well, actually, as a business leader, we can trust that you've got your clients' best interests at heart. You can talk about why you actually care. You can talk about, as you say, like if we actually want to solve big problems for them and help them with the emotional side of it, we do have to understand the emotional side of it so we can prioritize. And I think we can all agree with, like, see that and go, yeah, I can see that it's not just a tactic. It's not just, oh yeah, I'm using this clever principle of influence or whatever to twist a knife and get a result, and so that I can get more money from my business.
Charge them more.
Yeah, it has a greater good goal. Yeah. However, I want to use a slightly different angle to look at it, is when training a team, because it's one thing to do it yourself, but it's another to then train a team to then use your sales approach. And I can see two risks. One, when other business leaders are hearing this, is one that I hear often when I talk about processes relating to areas that are softer, sales calls, discovery calls, advisory calls. There's kind of a concern over how can I possibly have a process, a checklist for doing something that's so open-ended. They might say anything, particularly in this. There might be any emotions come up. And of course, we talk about, well, actually, you put the structure in place that includes asking questions like, how does your accounting make you feel? And then you give room for the conversation to develop and so on. But then you provide structure for them to close the conversation and actually get to a buying decision and so on. So there's ways in which you can do that. But also there'll be this concern of, how do I train my team in a way that this doesn't feel disingenuous and it doesn't just feel like a tactic? So talk us through like how you've trained your team to embrace the emotions in sales, particularly if that's not been something they've done as part of their traditional sales process.
No, I think that's a great question. And so to be clear, we don't have a team of hundreds of people. We've got a fairly small sample size. But I do believe, and this is where I find these conversations interesting, because I was literally just doing a speaking event for Xero around vision and how that affects people. I think vision is one of the more clear-cut ways that you can get that alignment so that you can ensure that your sales team isn't operating, or they are operating within the guide rails that you want. So what do I mean by that? Well, I built our firm to be genuine in terms of we want to provide that support, that human aspect, that genuine relatability of, I hear your pain and I just want to help you any way that we can. That's really baked in our vision, meaning that's what we're working towards, is actually truly helping people at those planes, which then helps drive our core values, meaning we call them our IOUs: improvement, ownership, understanding. So we always want to improve ourselves and our clients. We always want to own, meaning not control, because it can come across that way, but own it, meaning this is on me. I got it, not you. And understanding, meaning we want to meet them on that open plane, because you don't know what kind of stuff people are dealing with at any point in time. So you can already see how the vision starts framing up core values, which then frames up the messaging within our firm, which also starts permeating into our hiring process. So when we're looking at hiring people, we look for specific words or things that they say or actions that they've done in their past that frame up or align with all of that. All of what I just said in terms of the visions and our core values and we found that as long as we are true to that process, meaning finding genuine people that are aligned there. And when I also say alignment, I should also expand on that a bit and say, we also make sure we are aligning our corporate values and goals with our people's personal values and goals. Because now you've got an ingrained, fully aligned person and business, which creates engagement, which then if you have the vision and the culture and everything that I'm describing, you've now got someone sitting there saying, if I'm in sales and I can take this approach and I can do all the training that Kelvin's given to me, and I know that this is our vision and what we're working towards, and I know what we can do, and I know that this helps me progress as a person and professionally in these three, you've got this whole alignment across the board. People will follow those guide rails that I had briefly described. That's the guide rail. They'll follow that path because it's just the path. It's them. It's how they operate. And I appreciate that sounds a little bit fuzzy, but it actually takes a lot of work and effort to define everything that I just described. We've got a very defined system and process across all of that. It took us a year plus years to actually build all of that out. So it's not fuzzy in the sense of I'm just saying this. Like we've actually built out our vision, the vision of the company. We've got a 3 to a 4 page document. We get our new team members to look at it. It's one of the first things they do. Improvement, ownership, understanding, our core values. We've got a whole document around that. We've got examples. We speak to it. Like that's one thing that I found really hard as a leader. You actually need to be referring to and reinstilling these beliefs as time goes on. Because if you don't, it's just you saying stuff or putting it on paper once, and you're expecting someone to remember it 12 months from now at the Christmas party every time you talk about it. So there's all of these steps and processes that are required before everything that I just said happens. But if you can do it, it becomes much easier over time because you've stacked up all of that effort and it compounds, to use a financial analogy, your interest is compounding at that point in time. And it starts becoming easier because the whole team understands it, and they're all working towards that common goal.
That's really nice. And I love your description of how all of that kind of cascades down from the vision of what are you trying to create as a business, both in terms of the mission of, we want to help people and so on, but actually what's the business and the team that you're trying to create, and how does that feel and what their values are. And I really like your point around it can sound fluffy, but actually what we're really talking about is what are we documenting and how we're using it as part of our processes. And I can't remember which episode it was. I did an episode on how to embed your values in your organization. And I talked about how, it goes in all of your process, and you've beautifully articulated how you've done that as part of your recruitment, your employee onboarding. And then we've got a perfect example here where you've got it in your sales process, and how presumably when you talk about as part of sales training, or if you were coaching one of your salespeople on, why these questions around their feelings and emotions matter, I imagine that you're connecting it back up to like the value of understanding and why that is so important as part of a vision and so on. And so that makes it so much easier for people to understand the positioning of where that kind of sits within what you're looking to do.
I'm laughing a bit because at least we communicate on Slack, and we just had a Slack go back and forth over the weekend around, we're trying to unbottleneck certain points of our business. And one of those points, we had our team build out the SOP, or at least the, we call them the SFD, the, bad word, first draft. And so it came out and I looked at it and it was very technical, meaning step, 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 step. Mm-hmm. And what was the first thing that I said in commentary? It was like, what's our why here, people? Like, how does this relate back to the top? I don't need like a 10-pager on this, but we need to continually remind people in every process and document that we've got around the why behind it. So a paragraph, 2 to 3 sentences, or maybe one sentence, I kind of don't care, but as long as it ties back up to why are people doing this? Why does this matter? Again, just so they can tie it back and align it with that vision and the core values and everything that we're doing. Literally every document and every step that we do all ties back up to that top. And again, it took me a while to realize that, but reiterating that and how we talk as a team and every document piece that we do, how key that is, because it's just continual reinforcement around our core why, helping people.
Yeah, 100% agree. And it reminds me, I remember when I interviewed Adrian Dorison on the podcast, we talked about the importance of your processes need to have the outcome. Like, what are you looking for? Why does this actually matter before you go into the information of actually how do you do this, and then provide the permission, the clarity on what they're allowed to do and what's expected and so on. I think so many times, with one of my businesses with AirManual, when we're working with clients on helping them document processes, often that's one of the common mistakes, right? Is losing that sense of what's the outcome that we're trying to create. And it's funny, it was making me smile when you're describing. Yeah. So, we help them put in that paragraph at the top because it's literally a process consultant of ours. Like literally that's how she starts whenever she's talking about a process. So first we start with the paragraph, the why. Yep. And it's one of those things that could be easily seen as very tactical nuance. It's like, it's a detailed thing, how to document an SOP. But actually as a leader, what we're talking about really is how do you fundamentally embed your values, your mission, how you want people to behave and think into all of your ways of working. And often it's one of the concerns, ironically, it's one of the concerns that people have about having documented processes is because they say, oh, but I don't want to turn my people into robots. I want them to be able to think for themselves and understand the outcome and understand the why and the values and so on. It's like, well, how do you think you get that? How do you think that you give them that clarity on why each of these processes is done, particularly when they're new to a role and they're new to a particular task? It's very easy for them to get stuck in to getting stuck in. They're just doing the task and not really doing the zooming out to do that. And so,
well, and I think what you just said is really interesting too, right? Because it's not just that, but I've come to learn again over my many, many years that psychologically people will fill gaps with their brain, with whatever their brain makes up. And so if you don't firstly have the process or the document at all, speaking to the robots piece, I can't have robots. My experience and everything I've been taught would tell me that you can still create a process and not have a robot, firstly. But if you don't have the process, you're right, you don't have robots, but you don't have what you think you do because that person has just filled the knowledge gap with whatever they think is right. So now they are operating on their values, their process, whatever they believe is to be true. And so you need that process to create that structure. And then, like you say, you just then need to reinforce it with 1 or 2 sentences around the why. Like, what is the high level purpose of this specific task? I just need a reminder. Yep, makes sense. What's my purpose behind this? Go. Now there's no gaps across the board. I've got the technical ability to do it, as well as the overarching vision and how it ties back to that.
Yeah, I love that. And with team members, so my experience has been, you give them the processes and so on, you give them the training and the onboarding and so on, and they go through the journey. And typically the better you've got that process, the better the standard that you can get them to really quickly. Typically we talk about getting people so that they're adding value, and you're kind of aiming for 60 to 80% of the level of expected performance, typically in our businesses and with our clients within a week of them joining, because I've generally found that A players really want to be adding value, and so you need to get them there quickly. But you always need to do a bit more, and particularly through coaching and so on, to get them to that 100% and beyond in terms of against your expectations rather than their capability. What's the ongoing support, coaching, role playing, etc., that you do with your teams to help them develop that skill in diving into the emotions and making that a very natural, supportive conversation?
Yeah, I think what you said is one of the keys. So we call ourselves 2080 for a reason. I do ascribe by Pareto's law, where 80% of stuff can usually be handled. And then the other 20% is what you have to deal with in terms of, it's probably not as structured. It's a little more malleable. There's a little more soft skills, say in the case of sales or advisory. And so for that, we actually use role playing. That's come to me with your case, or I will make one up. But say in the case of advisory, there's tons of use cases just within our client base. Here's the situation. This is what it looks and feels like. Like, this is how the person's actually reacting. This is how I think we should proceed. And we just sit down and we go through that process where it's, I've got slightly more experience. I'm not the smartest person in the room, but I do have more experience. And so it's just coming to the table with a different viewpoint, because everybody thinks differently because of how they're subconsciously built and how they've been taught. And so just sitting down with somebody with a different perspective. And so sometimes we'll actually even do this in teams, meaning it's not just myself, it'll be multiple other people. We'll run through the use case, and then essentially we've got a framework around how we ask questions. So we've got like clarifying questions. Then the person receives that feedback, provides a little more context around, okay, no, by this particular item, I actually meant this based off what you just asked. So they've got a little bit of more feedback. But then we'll actually shut it down and we'll say, okay, what is the team's suggestion for how this person should proceed? The person's actually not allowed to talk. And what that does is it's not intended to be like an attack. It's in a safe, open space. But what it is intended to do is not create a feedback loop where somebody gets defensive, hops in and starts undermining potential really useful suggestions. So it surfaces those suggestions very quickly. And then there's open conversation at the end of that with the person now having received all of the suggestions. They might not be able to process it right away. Sometimes they can, But if they can't, then they take it back and think about it. But then that's where the solutioning piece comes out. It's like, okay, what can I take out of all the suggestions just provided to me out of this role in the situation and context that we've all discussed as a team with varying viewpoints and opinions? And what can I take out of it as a human and apply to it, I think, in the best practical way? And there's never any right or wrong answers. There's just a potential range of solutions. And then that person kind of picks one or two or three or makes up their own based off of that and then proceeds forward with that. And so it's interesting because I was literally just reading an article or heard a podcast or something around if you only have one piece of advice or one option, it usually leads to failure like the majority of the time. If you have 2 to 3 options, it actually leads to success like 80 to 90% of the time. And so just by providing those range of options for somebody to think about, think through, and even present back to the client in the case of, say, advisory, it makes success much higher. And it also, in that case of advisory, it allows people to even take those suggestions back to the client and talk it through with them too, and provide even more suggestions. And of course, you can apply this in the sales side too. Like I've done it in the past where you have that same situation where it's like, we'll role play and then we'll sit down and go through that same process where it's, what did you feel went right? What did you feel went wrong? What are some suggestions that we can do? Open safe space. How do you take that back, unpack it, process it, and then learn from it and improve from there?
I love that. I think it's something that I've surprised myself so many times with how valuable the role playing is. And both from perspective of helping someone to improve their own performance by, as you say, listening, going through it, and then providing feedback and then processing and so on. And that is awesome. I've also found as a business owner, there's a huge amount of value in doing a role play and seeing how are we showing up for our clients.
Isn't it though?
About the advisory. It's crazy because sometimes, particularly over time, like little tweaks and so on, like it can shift in a particular way. And so I've done role plays where I've gone, we shouldn't do it that way round. Like we literally just need to switch these 2 steps and it'll completely change this. And live in the role play, we've said, we've kind of paused and said, let me drop character a moment. It feels like we're going down this route, which feels weird. Let's just change it this way. And literally live on the role play, we've like changed the phrasing of how we'd introduce the business or whatever. And then it's like, right, go again and go, oh yeah. And both of us could feel, that's way better. Yeah. And I love the fact that it's not just about coaching the person and trying to help them, but actually looking to improve the process is really powerful as part of that. And, addresses a common activity that a lot of business owners should be doing more often than they are. It's like mystery shopping, like really testing what's the experience to buy from you. And role playing is a really low stakes, high value way of doing that. So I think the way that you describe it and also the way that you're using it when you're using it with teams is so powerful. So thank you for going to that level of detail.
Well, and I think what you just said on the role playing, because I'm glad I'm not the only person that has felt like that, because I've had what you just described too, where you'll run through a situation as a persona. So sometimes when we present options, say in the case of sales training, we'll walk through a persona because you always hit different people in different styles. Yep. And you'll walk through the persona and what you thought was a good process for 1 or 2 other personas completely should get flipped around once you start thinking from their perspective, because it's like, oh God, if this person thinks this way, what was just said here, here, and here could actually be offensive or create friction in some way, shape, or form. So like, we're actually in our own way here, people, but we didn't realize it because we just created the one system and processes across a broad range of personalities. And the reality is maybe 1 or 2 people need just a tweak. That's it. And then they'll feel much better coming out of it.
Yeah, I really like that. It makes me smile because I'll share a very specific example that I've not shared in this podcast before, which is as part of, for one of my software businesses, for SpiderGap actually, which is a 360 feedback tool. So typically the client or the personas are either heads of HR or heads of learning and development or are consultants, like organizational consultants, people consultants. And I remember a particular role play that I wrote as part of the training for essentially the kind of salespeople, the customer success people. And it was Sean from Consultio/Consultius, which, by the way, for those people that know that reference, please do post in the comments. I'd love to see that. But the idea and the way that the persona is written is it's a consultant that's very fast moving and very direct and high pace. And so they're just like, yep, and they just want to get straight to the demo. And therefore, having conversations about the emotion, the goals, and so on has to be done in such a way. Otherwise, it's going to create a lot of friction because they're like, yep. Okay, can you show me the tool? What's the pricing? And so that's a really interesting example where we found that you can still do it. You can still have a conversation about the emotion and so on, but you either have to handle it. You have to handle the fact that they just want it, like, can we just go straight to the demo? In which case, there are ways in which you can do that, but you either have to address it and get them to agree that actually, yes, it's helpful if I understand this, perhaps even so that you can shorten the demo, so that I can prioritize what to show you or whatever, because there's a lot of the tool. It's helpful if I understand your goals and some of the pains that you've had in the past. Oh yeah, that makes sense then. Okay, well, it's this. Great, now I can do this. And so we found that was a really good way. So I love the fact that you say actually the personas and testing your process using those different ones is a really powerful one, and particularly when we're talking about the emotional side, because if you've got questions about how does it feel, you really want to test that journey and get your team to be able to practice with the different emotions and the different areas of the service that's been providing the emotion that it brings. So that's pretty amazing. We've talked about sort of getting the essentially emotional intelligence into sales processes. We've talked about we've talked about so many other things, including going right back out to your vision and how that permeates down and so on. For business leaders that are looking to scale or sell their companies, what would you say is the first step really to incorporating emotional intelligence into their sales process to drive that big value, to drive that growth for those businesses who are like, yeah, I can see that what Kelvin's saying is correct, is right, and we need to do more of this. Where would you recommend they start?
Yeah. So to be honest, I would go back up to the vision. Make sure that you incorporate it and align it with whatever you're trying to achieve, because we're coming from a position where I feel like emotion can solve so many angst and areas of pain in the accounting and finance industry that I believe it's our superpower. But you can apply these across any industry, anywhere, anytime. You just need to make sure that the emotional piece aligns with your overarching vision. And then what you want to do is start unpacking, the strategy behind the vision. How are we going to hit our milestones, which then gives you the tactical, how do we actually then hit those goals? And then you can start seeing how, okay, I've decided that emotional intelligence is something we want to work on. I'm making sure that it doesn't go counter to our vision. It's probably the more important question, because if it's creating unalignment, it's going to create friction and it will never happen. So it does check. Strategically, I want to work on this, not maybe these next 3 months, but maybe the 3 months after. Perfect. Now, what are the steps that we need to do to start incorporating it? If you need to learn more about emotional intelligence, that would actually be the first step. Go talk to other people. I'm always a huge person around community and peer advisory. So there's other people out in the industry that you're in that have gone through already what you are going to go through. Go talk to them about it, because some of them might actually already be doing some of this emotional selling. So go talk to them. There's also people that are probably not in your industry that are doing this right now. Go talk to them, get their feedback, learn how you could conceptualize how you could actually loop it into that strategy, that overarching strategy. That'll then start framing up the tactics that you need to actually execute on that. So, okay, well, I talked to Kelvin. I really like what he says here, here, and here. Now I need to actually map out what that looks like in our actual sales process. So maybe I need to redo our pitch deck, or maybe I need to redo our SOP, is probably a first place. Let's start writing that. Let's start ingraining it into the ethos. So it all starts with a vision, though, making sure it's aligned, going down to strategy, then going down to the tactics. And I would also say it's not just a single step in the sense of iterate. It's one thing to take that first step. The first step's never the best. If it is, then you're amazing and I bow down to you. And it's not saying it can't happen. It can. But usually your first step is not the best step. So just appreciate that it's a journey and keep reiterating off of it. That's one thing I've definitely learned the past few years is the more that you iterate, the better off you'll be.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and particularly my experience on the process side is, the one thing about the process is it will not stay the way that you immediately document at the beginning, or at least More accurately, I should say it shouldn't,
It
because
shouldn't.
it should be developing and iterating.
If you're not growing, you're dying, right? If you're not growing, you're dying.
And if you're not growing, you're dying. Yeah, I like that. So I want to hit you with some quick fire questions now to close us out. One sentence answers only. First question is, what's one thing that causes most stress for you?
Most stress for me is my people, making sure that my people are taken care of, to be honest. I'm a big people person. It's super important to me.
Cool. What book or podcast has been most pivotal for you in changing your life for the better?
The E-Myth by Michael Gerber. That one's going back a few decades, but it's essentially, to me, it's the granddaddy of them all. EOS and a bunch of other things have basically come off of that book. So it provides you with the fundamental knowledge, and you would appreciate this being a process person. It's the fundamental building blocks of how do you create a business, not a job. The key path to that is systems and processes.
Love it. And what's the one thing that you want business leaders to take from this episode?
If you're not growing, you're dying. To me, I love that one because it's not just you need to be big and you need to grow your top line. It's growing as a person. Be open to change, look at things with different lenses, ask yourself if you're doing things the right way. Because sometimes you're not. I mean, even when we talked about the sales process, putting yourself in role-playing shoes, sometimes you're not actually doing the right thing and you just don't know. So be curious, be open to change, ask different questions. You'll be surprised at what comes out of it.
Nice. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Kelvin. I'm going to make sure that in the show notes, we link to your profile on LinkedIn, also to your websites, 2080.co and takethehelm.app. Anything else that we should link to in the show notes?
Nope. You can find me on LinkedIn. I love lurking around there. If you have any questions, DM me. I'm an open book. I love talking to people because I'm a rabbit. I go down rabbit holes. So it helps me frame up sometimes how I think too.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Kelvin, for joining me. And to everyone else, thanks so much for listening. If you found this episode useful, and I'm sure you did, particularly if you're listening at this point, then please do share it on social media and tag me and Kelvin in. We'd really, really appreciate it. And would like to continue the dialogue and have the conversation. But otherwise, until next time, have fun.